March 9, 1974. A Filipino jungle on Lubang Island. A thin, sun-scarred man in a tattered military uniform steps out of the tree line. His rifle is still oiled. His bullets are still counted. His boots are still polished. He looks like a ghost from another era, because he is one. World War II ended in 1945. This man has been fighting it, alone, for 29 more years. He didn't miss the news. He didn't get lost. He refused to believe the war was over, because the one order he was given, he obeyed to the letter: never surrender, never take your own life, we will come back for you. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, the soldier who held a one-man war for 3 decades, and the extraordinary chain of events it took to finally bring him home. Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Kainan, Japan. As a young man he worked for a trading company in Hankou, China, sharp, disciplined, fluent in Chinese. War changed his path. In 1942 he was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army. Onoda wasn't just infantry. He was selected for something rarer, training at the Nakano School, Japan's elite academy for intelligence officers. Nakano didn't teach soldiers to charge machine guns. It taught them guerrilla warfare, sabotage, survival, and, above everything, endurance without instructions. Students were drilled with one core belief: a Nakano officer's mission does not end because headquarters goes silent. It ends when the mission is complete, or when a superior officer personally cancels it. That single idea would define the next 30 years of his life. In December 1944, Lieutenant Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines. His orders came directly from Major Yoshimi Taniguchi: harass the enemy, sabotage the harbor and airstrip if the island fell, and gather intelligence for the eventual Japanese return. And then came the words Onoda would carry like scripture for 3 decades. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may not commit suicide. If you're captured, tell the enemy nothing. Weeks later, American and Filipino forces stormed Lubang. Japan's garrison was crushed almost overnight. Most surrendered. Some died. Onoda and a handful of stragglers vanished into the mountains. By the time Japan formally surrendered in August 1945, Onoda was already deep in the jungle interior with 3 other men: Corporal Shoiki Shimoda, Private Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. Leaflets started falling from the sky within weeks. The war is over. Come down from the mountains. Onoda's men found them. Onoda inspected them, and dismissed them as Allied propaganda. The leaflets looked wrong to a trained intelligence officer's eye, the tone too casual, the seals unfamiliar, the whole thing engineered, he believed, to lure Japanese holdouts into an ambush. More followed. Newspapers were airdropped. Photographs of the ruined homeland. Letters, even, claiming to be from family members. Search parties came to the island with loudspeakers, walking through the jungle calling his name. Onoda watched most of it from a hidden ridge and concluded the same thing every time: this is enemy deception, and my orders have not been cancelled. To understand this, you have to understand what he'd actually been trained for. A Nakano officer expected disinformation. He expected the enemy to fake a surrender broadcast. The tragedy is that the very skill that made him an elite soldier, his resistance to being fooled, was the same skill that made him nearly impossible to rescue. So the 4 men settled into a routine that would last years, moving camp every few nights, stealing rice and bananas from local farms, killing the occasional cow for meat, mapping trails, and treating every villager who spotted them as a wartime informant to evade. They weren't hiding to survive. They believed they were actively serving, watching, gathering intelligence, waiting for the Imperial Army's promised return. The jungle wore them down one by one. In 1949, Akatsu walked away from the group alone. 6 months of wandering later, he surrendered to Filipino forces, the first crack in Onoda's unit, and in Onoda's eyes, a possible security breach that meant the enemy now knew they were still out there. In 1954, Shimoda was killed in a shootout with a search party on a beach. That left two men, Onoda and Kozuka. Two soldiers, fighting a war that had ended before either of their children, had they had any, would have been born. For the next 20 years, Onoda and Kozuka lived almost entirely off the island's edges. They built shelters that could be dismantled in minutes. They stole clothing, tools, batteries for a radio they used only to listen, never trusting what they heard. They rationed ammunition like it was gold, because in their minds, resupply might never come, or might come any day. They weren't inactive. Onoda considered himself still at war, and that meant operations. Over the years, he and Kozuka were involved in dozens of skirmishes with local police and farmers, burning rice stores they believed were being used to supply search parties, exchanging gunfire with patrols. Filipino authorities estimate around 30 islanders were killed across the decades of encounters with the holdouts. This wasn't a peaceful hermit story. It was a real, low-grade guerrilla campaign fought by men who genuinely believed they were still soldiers of the empire. Japan sent search parties in the 1950s. Family members recorded personal messages. Leaflets rained down again with photos and letters from relatives, including Onoda's own brother. Onoda listened to some of these broadcasts from concealment, close enough to hear his own name called across the tree line, and still walked away. He later explained that no verbal message, no leaflet, no family photo could override a written military order. Only a superior officer, in person, delivering a direct command, could end his mission. Anything less was, to him, potentially fabricated. By the late 1960s, most of the world had genuinely forgotten. Japan had rebuilt. It was hosting the Olympics, building bullet trains, becoming an economic power. And in a jungle 6 hours from Manila, two men were still filing intelligence reports to a command structure that no longer existed, for a war their own country had spent decades trying to move past. In October 1972, that changed. Kozuka was shot and killed by local police during a confrontation. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, Hiroo Onoda was completely alone. Japanese newspapers picked up the story of Kozuka's death, and with it came a stunning realization for the Japanese public: a soldier was still out there. Still fighting. Still waiting. Search missions were organized again. All failed. Onoda, now the sole survivor of his unit, had spent 29 years turning evasion into an art form. He could vanish in seconds. He knew every ridge and river crossing on Lubang better than any map. Then, in February 1974, a 24-year-old Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki arrived on the island. Suzuki was not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a search party. He was a college dropout traveling the world with a simple, almost absurd checklist: find a panda, find the abominable snowman, and find Lieutenant Onoda. Where professional search teams with loudspeakers and leaflets had failed for years, Suzuki succeeded in 4 days. He camped in the open, cooked visibly, and made no attempt to hide his presence, signaling, deliberately, that he wasn't a threat. Onoda, curious, approached him. They talked. Suzuki told him the war had been over for decades. Onoda's answer became one of the most quoted lines in the whole story. He said he would only stand down on the direct order of his commanding officer. Not a stranger. Not a broadcast. His actual superior, Major Taniguchi, in person. It sounds like an impossible demand. Suzuki treated it as a solvable problem. He flew home to Japan and started looking, and found something remarkable. Yoshimi Taniguchi, the man who had given Onoda his orders in 1944, was alive. He'd left the military and was working as a bookseller. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi flew to Lubang Island. He walked into the jungle to the exact spot where Onoda had lived for nearly 3 decades and read aloud, formally, the order relieving him of duty. For Onoda, the effect was instantaneous and total. This is the detail that makes the story so remarkable. It wasn't relief that hit him first, it was grief. He later described the moment as his entire world collapsing in on itself in seconds. Everything he had done, every year in hiding, every ambush, every night in the rain, the deaths of Shimoda and Kozuka, had been in service of an order that, it turned out, could have been cancelled at any point, by anyone with the authority to do it, decades earlier. He changed out of his uniform for what was, functionally, the first time since 1944. He surrendered his rifle, still functional, still clean, his ammunition, and his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos personally, in a formal ceremony. Marcos pardoned him for the killings committed during his decades of holdout activity, acknowledging that he had genuinely believed he was still at war. Hiroo Onoda came home to Japan on March 12, 1974. He was 52 years old. He had left as a young lieutenant in a nation at war. He returned to a nation of skyscrapers, television, and a nephew who now ran his family's business, a country that had built an entirely new identity in the years he'd spent motionless in time. Onoda struggled with the Japan he came back to. He later said he found the country's post-war culture unrecognizable, even uncomfortable, and moved to Brazil for a period to run a cattle ranch. But his story wasn't finished. He eventually returned to Japan and founded survival camps for young people, teaching wilderness skills born directly from the techniques that had kept him alive for 29 years, turning 3 decades of hardship into something he could actually pass on. He wrote a memoir, met with royalty, and became one of the most well-known symbols of a very particular kind of discipline, absolute, unbending loyalty to an order, even when the entire world around it has moved on. Hiroo Onoda died in 2014, at 91 years old. He was not the only holdout. A small number of Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific were found in the decades after the war, some as late as the 1970s. But none matched Onoda's story for sheer duration, discipline, and the strange, almost cinematic ending, found not by an army, but by a college dropout looking for a panda. 29 years. Not lost, not stranded, waiting, on purpose, for an order that could have come at any moment, if only someone had known where to deliver it. Hiroo Onoda's war says something uncomfortable about loyalty and obedience, that the line between unbreakable discipline and tragedy can be razor thin, and that sometimes, the bravest, most disciplined man in the story is also the one who paid the highest price for a war that had already ended. If you found this story as remarkable as we did, subscribe for more incredible true stories from World War II, and let us know in the comments, could you have held on that long?